Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. It's our great pleasure to welcome you after this fantastic artistic opening to the third ERSTE Foundation Tipping Point talk. 270 years ago, Benjamin Franklin flew a kite into a thunderstorm above Philadelphia to prove that such a thing as electricity existed. And from that moment onwards, it would take another 130 years until private households would make use of the beauties and possibilities of electricity via a brake light switch. Technology, or rather artificial intelligence and cognitive computing, are often compared to the invention and discovery of electricity. Now that we have discovered all these possibilities in the last years, we wonder how much longer will it take until we, individuals, can make use of the sheerly endless possibilities of technology and cognitive computing. And we also ask, at the end of the day, will democracy have survived that process? Power of law, or law of power. Why we need European leadership in governing technology globally is what we ask in this third Tipping Point talk. Welcome to all of you in the room at the Museum of Applied Arts here in Vienna. And a warm welcome specifically to those among you who have come in from Warsaw, from Belgrade, from Berlin, from Prague, in order to work with us on this question all day today at the MAC. And you worked especially on the Central European and Southeastern European implications of that question. The technology, the policy. Welcome also to all of you who join us via live stream tonight. Let me start again with a big thank you to composer Rupert Huber, who opened this evening, and to the team around Ars Electronica who made the technical details around this installation and intervention that you just saw possible. Thank you also to the dancers, Eva Schaller, Eva Maria Kraft, and Dominik Grünbühl. Let me now present the two visionaries, enablers, and hosts who made this event here possible. Christoph Thun-Hohenstein of the Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna and Boris Marte of ERSTE Foundation.
Good evening, welcome to the MAC. It's great that you are here. I would echo Verena's remark towards the performance, it was terrific. And thank you, ERSTE Foundation, for an amazing partnership. We're very happy that we are part of the Tipping Point talks, and especially the talk on possibility is just the right talk for us here at the MAC. I give you one of my favorite quotes, and probably 90% already know it, but it's always worth repeating. It's by William Gibson, and it says the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I would add, it's just not well enough regulated, and certainly not evenly regulated. Yeah? And this is part also of what we are talking about tonight. So we at the MAC here work on the basis of the realization that we live in a new modernity. A new modernity is something that changes everything, and in our case at enormous speed. And we have all to work very hard on that modernity so that it doesn't slip us away and does with us what we don't want it to do with us. And we are exactly in that danger right now. There's no time to lose. And digitalization is the one big force, including AI, robotics, and many other things. But of course also what we call climate care here at the MAC. The other big topic of the magic triangle. And the third one is social sustainability. And you can add social inclusion into that and a lot of other things that are part of social sustainability. And we have to work on this triangle, on these three topics, this magic triangle, in a spirit, in a holistic spirit, I would say. Yeah. We have to see what the connections are, and there are many connections, and how we can turn the digital modernity into an ecological and social digital modernity. That's the key challenge. And it's against that background that I initiated the Vienna Biennale, and you're here also because it's still on. Erste Bank is our key sponsor of the Vienna Biennale, and the exhibitions are still on until October 6th, so please go and see them. It's about brave new virtues and how we can shape our digital world. And this is very much at the forefront because we need the input, the perspectives of everybody, of the arts and all other corners of society, of the spectrum of society, and we need to work them together. We need cooperation at all levels. So let's work on it. We are very excited now later to hear the talk, the lecture by Marietje, and the panel discussion that will follow. And as I said this morning also in a smaller gathering, I wake up every morning and my first remark to myself, my first thought is, I live in a new modernity. What can I do to shape this modernity? Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Krzysztof, and thank you also for hosting us here. It's a great experience. We like it here very much. I think we should move our office here, huh? Do you have some office space? No? Okay. This was a joke. After Francis Fukuyama's talk on identity politics, the demand for dignity and the nation-state's future, and Timothy Snyder's speech to Europe on Judenplatz 1010, which has become a viral star, we now are happy and delighted and extremely thankful that you, Marietje, accepted our invitation for the third Tipping Point talk this year in the Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna. Now, let me welcome you all in the name of ERSTE Foundation, and it is a special occasion to have this third Tipping Point talk here in the museum. Malcolm Gladwell gave us the words for our initiative this year. Quote, "Look at the world around you. It may seem like an immovable, implaceable place. It is not. With the slightest push in just the right place, it can be tipped." The Tipping Point Talks are a series of lectures organized by us on the occasion of the 200th birthday of ERSTE Group and the Savings Banks. Being founded in the year 1819 by a group of, now listen to this, Gutmenschen, as it is written in one of the first documents, in the outskirts of Vienna as a financial service for the poorest of the poor. As legacy of that story, today, the main shareholder of ERSTE Group is a charitable foundation converting the dividends into public and social value. We, as foundation, always considered us as a laboratory for new thought and also a hub-building, vigorous network looking for options and solutions. Our intention from the beginning was to create a space to allow people to get out of their inherited orthodoxies and get into the business of discovering maybe some truth. Free the minds, redirect perception, build coalitions. Exactly what happened throughout the day here in the museum with an outstanding lineup of handpicked experts, pioneers, activists from the tech and from governments. It was exciting. How the European tech environment will look like has great relevance for us all and for us as a bank especially, because as a financial institution so dependent on big tech, we always have to relate to a bigger picture in order to get the things right. So, Marietje, welcome. You were named International Director of Policy at the Cyber Center and International Policy Fellow on Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence at Stanford University quite recently. So congratulations on that. Right? Many of us got to know you, Marietje, as very active, pioneering Dutch member of the European Parliament between 2009 and 2019. In the European Parliament, she served as a member of D666, part of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe political group. She was coordinator on the International Trade Committee, where she was the ALDE spokesperson on transatlantic trade and digital trade. Marietje also served on the Committee on Foreign Affairs, the Subcommittee on Human Rights. She was the vice president of the US delegation and served on the Iran delegation and the delegation of the Arab Peninsula. Furthermore, Marietje Schaake founded the European Parliament Intergroup on the Digital Agenda for Europe. She's a member of several prominent boards and commissions on digital policy worldwide. She's a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Marietje was featured by Politico as one of the 28 most influential Europeans in the class of 2017, and Brussels journalists have called her the EU's most, as I wrote it, I made a mistake because I wrote EU's most weird politician. But I like that kind of. So EU's most wired politician. So you can imagine how honored we are to have you here, and we're looking forward to your speech. The floor is yours.
So a couple of years ago, when I was still in the European Parliament and we had the Romanian presidency, we had a meeting in the former presidential palace, now the Parliament. And it is one of the heaviest buildings, if not the heaviest building in the world, for many reasons. It sits atop of a hill, but really the ruins of the old city of Bucharest, where 40,000 people used to live, go to church, synagogue, play, and go to school. And it's hard to experience how today it is actually a parliament, when the architecture that's all around you is still so pompously authoritarian. But inside there was a small exhibition on the history of hunger and repression, because even when food shortages were extreme in the 1980s, there was a weekly program with Ceausescu. It was supposed to convince all Romanians that the wealth and the success of the communist model were abundant. But as food was being exported to help the national budget, and the breadlines of desperate Romanians were shaping in the streets, there was a problem, because there was actually no more fruit, no more harvest available to build the decor for this television show in which the president was to show that everything was going well. So as a result, they took wood, they shaped apples out of it and painted them to suggest that everything was still in order. And it was a perfect background, of course, for sharing lies and keeping up the horrible appearances that took place in that country. And in those days, in the 1980s, there were no mobile phones to document the story of breadlines in the street in the meantime, and the state security was so severe that it even kept all types of typewriters on archive to make sure that anonymously written letters could be traced back to the senders if necessary. Now, fast forward to 2016, when Russian intelligence operations tried to manipulate the US presidential elections through hacking and disinformation campaigns. Many people noted at the time that propaganda, information campaigns, and disinformation, bending the facts and eroding trust to drive populations in the arms of strong leaders were nothing new. And certainly people in Central and Eastern Europe, a part of the world that many of you present here today know well, have in recent history been bombarded with state-crafted narratives blasted over the national broadcasting media. And in Hungary, history is back in the form of Viktor Orban, who preaches so-called illiberal democracy, which I believe is a contradiction in terms. But he does so from the ranks of the biggest political group in the European Union, while placing hundreds of media outlets under state control. Now, without the freedom for different voices to speak, people are not only indoctrinated, but they become skeptical of anything they hear. They may say things like, and I hear it even among my friends, I don't watch the news anymore. And they've lost faith in whether anything or anyone can be trusted at all. And that's a problem, because when people stop trusting and stop participating, a big blow to democracy has already been dealt. So information flows and the question of who controls the narrative have always been political. When governed for repression, media and information become instruments that strengthen dictators at the expense of populations. But when governed for democracy, pluralist debate and critical journalists speak truth to power, and they empower the populations, no matter whether it's on the radio or television or on the internet. So more than just the medium, the governance and the values anchoring governance and regulations are decisive for the outcomes. Whether the rule of law is respected is what sets free societies apart from dictatorial ones. In other words, whether governed by the power of law or by the law of power makes all the difference. And there are very few good examples of what happens when power is centrally concentrated. The promise of disrupting, with very few good examples of what happens when this power is concentrated centrally, the promise of disrupting monopolies of power and information created what I think was an understandable excitement around the technological revolution. And very soon that impact became visible. WikiLeaks published confidential diplomatic cables and Edward Snowden revealed intelligence gathering methods of the American surveillance state. And they were very far-reaching. So it showed that individuals could really embarrass even the most powerful states and pierce through diplomatic and security protocols just like that. In the summer of 2009 and also afterwards, people all over the world could see in real time how the police was beating protesters in Iran, Tunisia, Egypt, or Syria. And that was remarkable because in 1982 it had taken months for the news of the killing of thousands of people in Hama in Syria, it was a massacre, to reach the outside world at all. But today, a mobile phone makes us eyewitness to peaceful protests or police violence from Hong Kong to Venezuela. Information is power. And technologies are changing the relations of power as they change the flows of information and become a layer of all aspects of life. But we cannot only consider the aspect of the empowerment of individuals and the breaking through of monopolies. Because authoritarian states too have accelerated their control through surveillance technologies and more recently facial recognition tools. Private companies have become so powerful, catering to billions, and the data they collect pales the database of any country's government. We have to ask ourselves, who is governing who? As such, technology can be considered as an extension of agency, and outcomes very much depend on the governance of, as well as the governance by technologies. Through their architecture and their design, they are very essential, because it all hinges on the values guiding the processes and the results. Designing for profit, most likely, does not lead to optimal effects for democracy, and the most impactful technologies, such as automated weapon systems or facial recognition systems, will inevitably have deep consequences. The promise of empowering individuals and harboring democracy, with which mobile phones and social media platforms came, may also explain the reluctance by democratic governments to focus on rules for the digital age. It is a remarkable break with tradition, knowing the impact of information flows on freedom or on repression. But more fundamentally, given the position of Western democracies since World War II that have successfully designed a framework of agreements across borders to set benchmarks for trade flows, human rights, war and peace, as well as development. These rules and also the institutions that could apply the rules have framed the quality of life of our populations, ensuring that standards are in place and that accountability is possible. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights spells out the rights for all, majority and minority, men and women, young and old. Of course, it's not perfect, and there are too many violations happening every day, but imagine a world without the articulation of such principles. The World Trade Organization has been key to ensure that trade doesn't only flow, as it has for centuries, but that rules ensure higher standards and fairness between countries, but also companies engaged in that trade. The Geneva Convention seeks protection of soldiers and civilians, even when states are at war. And the World Health Organization prevents epidemics and offers vaccinations against measles and other diseases. Now today, and I think this is very clear to all of us, that rules-based order is under enormous pressure, along with democracy, human rights, or the space for civil society. And paired with the rise of nationalism that we see everywhere in the world, we can see how international cooperation, whether it's on climate change, migration, or digitization, is very challenging. So we meet here today at a moment where there's pressure on the rules-based order, and also while that rules-based order does not yet sufficiently cover the digital domain. And that's remarkable because the West had a pole position to develop such rules. The United States, at least until recently, I would say, had an absolutely dominant position in the development of technology products and digital services. But guided by a combination of a self-centered view, a belief in the First Amendment, a libertarian culture that we now know to be quite typical for Silicon Valley, but also with armies of lobbyists, companies convinced lawmakers that any regulation of the internet would stifle innovation, and that authoritarian regimes would be inspired by regulatory steps in the United States to repress, for example. Now, I could only wish that authoritarian regimes would take such inspiration from what we do in democracies. But speaking of regulation of the internet, which continues to be met with a lot of pushback, including from civil society groups that I deeply appreciate, would we describe the need to use safety belts in cars as regulation of traffic or as regulating for road safety? Do we regulate the internet, or do we ensure that algorithmic decisions are accountable, as we regulate for fair competition and free speech in other sectors? I think it's not only more helpful, but also more legitimate to focus on the principles that should be safeguarded, no matter what technological revolutions or disruptions we might see. And certainly democratically elected governments that act based on a mandate of their people have every legitimacy to regulate. But at the same time, we see precious time is lost to seek effective leadership towards a rules-based system. And this rules-based system preserve the benefits of the open internet and other technologies. There are definitely very exciting opportunities that we all enjoy every day and that more people all over the world should enjoy. But we should also ensure that there's a protection of rights of people using the internet wherever they may do so. And an alternative model to a global rules-based order is gaining ground. And I see the digital domain increasingly as its frontier. The government of China believes that states should manage and contain their own internet. It's basically an embrace of the Westphalian model to the online domain. A recent implementation of the concept of cyber sovereignty in China's cybersecurity law requires foreign firms that do business in China, and there's many of those, to store their data on Chinese territory, and that makes inspections for a variety of reasons a lot easier. Other articles in the law disproportionately interfere with Chinese people's right to privacy or freedom of speech. And people in China are, as you may have heard, taking scores on the basis of their behavior, the so-called social credit system. At the same time, the Uyghur communities, a large Muslim minority, are imprisoned in high-tech surveillance prison camps. And it is clear to me that minorities anywhere are often the first to experience when technologies exacerbate repression and discrimination. So we know the governance model that China deploys, and we also know that the country and the government and the Communist Party are hyper ambitious to develop artificial intelligence technologies. And so knowing that matters of governance and questions of which values go into the systems are only becoming more urgent. And I think that if artificial intelligence is to be seen as inevitably benefiting from, but also helping to build centralized data governance, we should think twice about idealizing it. And if instead we believe that the technology can be built so it serves humanity and democracy, we must prove so. Now, China does not only have ambitions at home, but also through the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese companies harvest as much data as possible, including through the rollout of apps in countries like India, but also many countries on the African continent, in countries where people's rights and their data are not at all protected. In the meantime, we know well that there are fundamental questions about the separation between the Communist Party, the Chinese state, and private companies. Knowing that, I was reading a new study this week that Carnegie brought out, and it shows that the company of Huawei, which doesn't only produce network technologies and cell phones, but also surveillance technologies, is now operating in 50 countries. And there is no other company that has a comparable market share in this space. So the question of technology governance, I believe, is becoming a more and more important element of foreign policy and a key strategic question of our time. Now, we may not see tanks rolling in the streets, but we know that people in China cannot find records online, and not even in private messages, of that day in 1989, when tanks crushed people on Tiananmen Square. We see AI-enabled censorship rolled out globally. And in diplomatic efforts too, China actively seeks to shape global norms on the basis of what it considers responsible state behavior online. So the sovereignty model that doesn't put the rule of law or the rights and freedoms of users first is being rolled out globally, and it also has, I should mention, profoundly protectionist effects. Now, at the other end of the top-down controlled sovereignty model, we see a market-powered model. The infamous quote by Mark Zuckerberg, "Move fast and break things," was an ambition as once voiced and long was a sort of informal motto in Silicon Valley. And I think the breaking things has been quite a success. Many sectors are entirely disrupted, from the transport sector to media, as has been mentioned earlier today as well. And if they are not yet disrupted, the sectors, they will be soon. And I'm thinking about the financial services, so I hope ERSTE Bank is taking preparations, but also healthcare and many, many other sectors. And very, very significantly, we see that democracy is being disrupted. Now, the irony is that many of the people running the largest tech companies, while they're busy avoiding the law or staying ahead of it, effectively became regulators themselves. Through the design of technology optimized for efficiency, customers' eye time, or personal data shared, CEOs have been in the business of governing without appreciating that role and without having a democratic mandate, for example, and certainly without the kinds of checks and balances needed. Over the past roughly 20 years, when the internet spread and connected billions, companies like Facebook, Google, Twitter, Amazon, we all know them very well, became the guardians of information flows. And others, slightly less known but also quite powerful, like Palantir, are analyzing data for commercial intelligence purposes. And there are many, many smaller companies whose names probably don't resonate with any of you, but that are building commercial, off-the-shelf surveillance and hacking tools for anyone who can afford it. Now, in many post-communist countries, memories of the notion of a Ministry of Information or a Minister of Truth invoke nightmares. And I should say it also invokes deep concerns in countries that were never communist. But effectively, the CEOs like Mark Zuckerberg and others are acting like arbiters of truth. They are increasingly uncomfortable with these big responsibilities, and so we hear Facebook, but also Apple's CEO now calling for regulation of content moderation, speech, and privacy. But short of that kind of regulation, companies' profit-driven algorithms and business models still decide whether a parent worried about their kid's health finds medical advice or a link convincing them that vaccination is actually damaging for children at the top of their YouTube search. And these kinds of outcomes probably explain why in 2019 we see sudden outbreaks of measles in countries like the United States. Company governance without oversight allowed Cambridge Analytica to harvest personal data to be used by repressive regimes or other governments to micro-target people and to influence election results, whether it was in the United Kingdom, the referendum, or in Kenya. Governing for profit optimization allows blatant conspiracies to rise above news stories in search results, and until recently, advertising categories, and I don't mention this lightly, but advertising categories. So if you wanted to place an ad on Facebook, you could click on these kinds of groups. They were groups such as Jew hater, or Hitler did nothing wrong, or people interested in Joseph Goebbels and Heinrich Himmler. Now imagine trying that as a store in the streets of Vienna. I think you'd run into serious trouble, and the law. But the question is really, does paying, instead of convincing, now determine one's position on the marketplace of ideas? And when a post on social media has thousands of likes to it, do these thumbs up, clicks, and hearts represent people, fake accounts, or bots? We know anecdotally, scandal by scandal, and we know that they should have consequences, but there is very little systematic transparency, let alone accountability. So I've tried to give you a sketch, an impression of the power of platform companies, and they decide what internet users see. But how the formulas of matching and collecting data and advertisements really work actually remains largely mysterious. The algorithms running the online lives of billions of people are considered trade secrets. They're protected from transparency and thus scrutiny and accountability to preserve a competitive advantage. So we know that algorithms that are constantly changed based on new settings and adaptations through machine learning, they use data collected on people to sell their customers advertisements against very precise categories, but there is no systematic oversight to assess whether principles such as non-discrimination, free speech, or fair competition are actually reflected in those computer codes. And let alone in the way in which, whether these computer codes respect the way in which these rights and freedoms are protected by law in most countries. We now even have a case of the American Department of Housing taking Facebook to court because it alleges that there were discriminatory ads for homeowners allowed on the platform. So to summarize a little bit, the technologies that came with the promise of democratizing have put democracy under pressure, and with the ideal and promise of the effects of disrupting monopolies, new monopolies have formed. New gatekeepers, tech oligarchs if you will, are processing massive amounts of information far removed from public oversight. And as soon as antitrust investigations were announced in the United States, just like they've taken place in Europe, we saw tech companies hiring more lobbyists for their campaigns in the American Congress, costing tens of millions of dollars every year. And 75% of the people hired to deal with these antitrust cases, 75% of the hired people to lobby, were previously working in relevant congressional offices. Speaking of revolving doors, the former chairman of the US Federal Trade Commission now lobbies for Amazon. Technology platforms are also funding a lot of civil society organizations that are working on tech policy, as well as, frankly, many academic programs. So because democratic governments have been reluctant to develop a rules and values-based order in the digital world, authoritarian regimes and private company interests are setting rules and standards. The question, therefore, and I say this also as a liberal, the question, therefore, is not whether we will see regulation, but rather who is in charge of it and based on which principles and with which desired outcome. Professor Lawrence Lessig foresaw the impact of governance through technology. He interpreted the governing power technology standards would have as equivalent to law in a book that I think is a must-read called Code is Law. In the year 2000, in an interview with Harvard Magazine, he said, and I'm quoting, "Ours is the age of cyberspace. It, too, has a regulator. This regulator, too, threatens liberty. But so obsessed are we with the idea that liberty means freedom from government that we don't even see the regulation in this new space. We therefore don't see the threat to liberty that this regulation presents. This regulator is code, the software and hardware that makes cyberspace as it is." End of quote. So fast forward 20 years, and we increasingly see companies, large and small, not only taking governing types of decisions, but actually stepping into the role of governments and to an extent now that this profoundly changes the role of the state. For example, critical digital infrastructure and services, such as those running taxation, the census, healthcare, and energy services, they're digitized, and they're not only built, but also protected by private companies. Online identity is usually verified through a credit card company or a social media company, hardly ever through a publicly issued identity for the online world. We know, I know bankers are paying attention, that Facebook has now proposed Libra, a new type of currency. And with sophisticated surveillance companies, I already mentioned them, hacking companies, for example, that are building offensive attack capabilities, the monopoly of violence is also slipping out of governmental hands. I believe that this broader dependence and the growing influence of the private sector has barely been dealt with in regulatory frameworks. Now, all of the implications of technology for the public interest, democratic governance, are exacerbated by artificial intelligence. And those of you who've had the opportunity to see the great exhibition here, Unheimlich Valley or Uncanny Valley, I would strongly recommend it here in the MAC. But if you haven't seen it yet, the exhibition opens with questions such as, is AI democratic? Or can AI be more intelligent than today's politicians? I was very happy they didn't talk about yesterday's politicians, but it also asks, can it ever understand what it means to live together as social beings? And so on, very essential questions. AI is not the future, the way some people talk about it, it's the present, and we will soon see an AI application available that's more widely going to be used, that is already invented but not used so widely now, an application that can create conversational language at a level that people like us cannot distinguish from human-generated. And you may have heard about deep fakes, which is the sort of video equivalent of that kind of technology, which basically allows anyone to be made to say anything through manipulated video. So if we thought that disinformation and trust erosion were a problem, just imagine what we're about to get into. We often look at incidents involving tech companies. I just mentioned the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and we tend to think about the abuse of technology. But what I think is important is that we also start looking critically at the use of technologies, the workings of technologies, exactly as they were intended. But then when I talk to computer engineers, AI engineers, they are most excited about the idea that through machine learning, pattern recognition, and various iterations of algorithms, artificial intelligence will actually produce unexpected outcomes. So I think we desperately need a public debate about how much risk as societies we find acceptable. And not only to focus on what is now very, very common, to focus on the race for global AI dominance. between the US and China, and question where Europe is. So thinking about these unintended consequences, unexpected outcomes of AI, I was reminded of an article that I read this week, an article that reminded me of the fundamental question of how much risk we should take as societies. There was an update on the gene-edited cow. You may have read it. It was presented a couple of years ago as a resounding success of new technologies in the United States. But now, 2 years later, it turns out that unintended mixing of DNA included bacteria that are also antibiotic resistant. So perhaps this case, and this example, will be reason for Americans and others to appreciate what we call the precautionary principle in Europe. We know it from the debate about genetically modified organisms, for example. A bit of a pause before we can assess the potential damage of the rollout of a new technology. The precautionary principle has often been ridiculed and has been labeled as unscientific, especially from the American side. But in this case, the scientific evidence came. It just came 2 years later. Another thing that we hear a lot these days, it's quite fashionable to answer many problems that we can discuss about artificial intelligence by pointing to ethics. I understood today that there are over 120 ethics guidelines developed in Europe as of now. And many tech companies have hired chief ethics officers, but I invite you to ask 10, 100, or 1,000 people in Beijing what's ethical, to do the same here in Vienna, do the same in Kiev, Amsterdam, Sao Paulo, rural America. Just get a sense. What do we really mean when we talk about ethics? And can we agree? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when agreed norms are violated? I think more than trying to meet the difficult questions of the impact of artificial intelligence with philosophical discussions about ethics, a focus on precaution or preventing the worst imaginable outcomes, as well as a focus on the principles that under the rule of law must be safeguarded, will have much more solid and constructive impact. And these kinds of assessments will have to include mechanisms of meaningful access to information, oversight, and research in the public interest. So I've shared with you why I feel so strongly and why there's a great sense of urgency for me to think about a rules-based order to ensure that principles that are key to our democracy, the quality of life of our people, are not further disrupted by either authoritarian forces or unaccountable technologies or companies. And the European Union has made some steps in this direction. We have the General Data Protection Regulation, but also net neutrality, competition policy, and a cybersecurity bill that puts the public core of the open internet at the heart of what needs to be defended. And the foundation of the fundamental rights in Europe applies to all regulations, including of tech, upholding, for example, the right to privacy. The EU has hereby started to show that technologies, even if they're built on the other side of the world, in other jurisdictions, can be made to respect rules that protect people and their rights. The fact that the General Data Protection Regulation is now globally adopted as a standard by software company Microsoft shows how companies make trade-offs when one significant jurisdiction, the EU in this case, pushes them to comply with certain standards. It may be easier for a company to just have one standard globally instead of different ones in different areas where they work. But given that this is indeed how standard setting tends to work, a combination of being the first and coming with scale of your standard, it also indicates how other global players are seeking to do the same, to set standards in their mirror image, but based on very different values. In Europe, while there's good steps in the right direction, we also still see a lot of piecemeal approaches and clear fragmentation of regulatory initiatives. I think there's too little connecting of the dots between, let's say, the newly adopted copyright directive, data protection, And then back to the ability to mine data for artificial intelligence. It's another ambition that we have, but that could be hampered by these two other laws. We also see proposals to regulate online content. This is a very hot topic, and they demonstrate a lot of fragmentation. Because generally, the online platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Google, and others, enjoy exemptions to being liable for illegal content that might be shared on their platforms. But the pressure to do something against this exemption of liability is really growing. In Germany, disinformation and content violating existing law is supposed to be removed very swiftly from online platforms, or the companies face significant fines. In the United Kingdom, there's now a new proposal to push companies to take down what are called online harms, and they cover anything from child abuse to disinformation. In France, there are plans to oversee algorithms by giving regulators that are now focused on media more authority. But in countries where trust in government is low, similar proposals would be seen as governmental attempts at censorship, not at strengthening the rule of law. And others fear that the proposals on the table in Germany, the UK, and France still lack independent oversight and keep granting and even outsourcing too much responsibility to the companies that are actually part of the challenge. And the question is really, are these companies in a position to assess whether content and speech is legal or not? And by creating mechanisms such as high fines and other consequences, they may actually over-censor because they don't want to get a fine. It's maybe easier to take down more content, and that in turn impacts free speech. So all these initiatives kind of zoom in on the urgent question of making clear how speech laws, in this example, should apply online as they do offline. And the principle that laws should apply online as they do offline is actually underscored by the United Nations, and it applies to any imaginable law. Now, I think that notion that we should build on laws that we have is a very good starting point for European efforts, but it won't be helped if we get 28 different interpretations. Instead, I think we should work towards agreement on broad principles as a sort of anchor point, and then empower regulators to assess whether these principles are violated. Because this will also make for more sustainable laws as technologies change fast. We cannot regulate technology by technology, but we can focus very much on principles. Europe must act with more speed and political ambition. It now has an opportunity with the new leaders just in office, still figuring it all out and being heard by the European Parliament. But there's now, at the new start of this political chapter, a real opportunity to present a more integrated vision on value-based technology governance and to connect the different policy areas and, very importantly, to start acting as a global player. We must ensure in Europe that development and human rights policies focus on the impact of technology and that programs then strengthen rule of law principles, also in the digital sphere. That means pushing for norms that prevent the escalation of cyber conflict and developing trade rules for data flows. It also means a more ambitious, integrated artificial intelligence strategy with room for public interest research, talent generation, and an ecosystem that's more friendly to doing business. And frankly speaking, the world is not waiting for us to get our act together. The Chinese tech giant Alibaba already proposed e-commerce or an eWTO mechanism to facilitate digital trade, and the trade wars between China and the US are impacting anything from software to technology supply chains. And again, while these are all very challenging circumstances, also for the rules-based order, this momentum gives the European Union the space to lead in showing what a values-based model for comprehensive tech governance looks like. The EU, more than many other global actors, has demonstrated in practice for decades now how rulemaking across borders is done and on the basis of values. So it therefore has not only the practical experience and the institutions to get this worked out and democratically controlled and mandated, but also it enjoys credibility in this space, also from a number of third countries that we haven't talked so much about today. Now, besides government-led efforts, there's a vibrant community of civil society experts, tech programmers, and private sector companies that are also engaged in all kinds of discussions and fora about non-binding solutions to tech governance. And this happens according to the so-called multi-stakeholder method, which is basically designed to have different people that are impacted by technology or by the norm that is discussed to have a seat at the table to give input before the decision making. And I think these are very noble and important efforts, but we have compacts, Magna Cartas, declarations, sets of principles, all coming forward from these initiatives. And what worries me about all these big words and different initiatives is that there's fragmentation and there is not a sort of strategic effort to collectively work out the more difficult details and to try to see these processes through instead of sitting together and declaring something. I also think that the different efforts around multi-stakeholder initiatives would benefit from a more pronounced, articulated set of values as a starting point, and also ensuring that there's enforcement. You can declare principles, but what happens the minute they're violated? That's usually when the real test happens. So I think in these various initiatives and with these various actors involved taking on greater roles in governing technology, it would be really good if rule of law principles should commit governments and companies and civil society in a more horizontal kind of governance effort for the digital age. And an adherence to rule of law principles should really be a litmus test for everyone at the table. I take, perhaps not surprisingly, inspiration from John Locke, who wrote that freedom in society means being subject only to laws made by a legislature that apply to everyone, with a person being otherwise free from both governmental and private restrictions upon liberty. But there's actually also earlier traces of the concept of the rule of law found in Islamic law and in Asian tradition, so I'm hopeful that it can have a more global resonance. The rule of law actually articulates a political situation, regardless of any country's specific legal rule, and it is therefore more suitable for a global context like the online world because it focuses on method besides substantial law, which is also very important, but rule of law principles are the notion of equality, meaning that everybody is equal and nobody is above rules and laws, transparency, very important, of rules and codes and processes that should be explicitly and publicly disclosed. And there should be mechanisms of appeal and redress when there is a ruling. The person impacted should be able to challenge that ruling. So just imagine, these are centuries-old concepts that have made the distinction between free and unfree, open and closed systems. But imagine if big tech companies that we just talked about a little bit were to apply these principles to algorithms alone. It would make accountability possible. And these principles, broadly, if adopted by companies, but also civil society and those multi-stakeholder groups that I talked about, would actually be a very good starting point for good governance of technologies. You might wonder, why on earth would companies do this? But they are feeling the pressure. There's a lot of pressure for them to do more, and I think the lack of experience in governance is also a bit of a search in order to see what the best answer is. Meanwhile, a lot of social media companies are now being accused by the American president, for example, for being too left-wing. Others think they may have other political biases. But they're also criticized, as I mentioned, for many, many decisions about content. A manipulated video of Nancy Pelosi was not taken offline. There was a lot of criticism with every decision to take content offline, like Daily Stormer, for example, a right-wing blog. There's also criticism. So to have articulated principles that apply equally and that are known to users and mechanisms for redress could actually really be an incentive for building credibility and trust, again, by these companies. It also allows, and I think that this is an interesting opportunity for companies too, when they're working in countries where the rule of law is not the standard, to make a commitment to their customers there that is of a much higher standard and gives them greater protection, regardless of the law of the land, so to say. So I think that that's also important. Now, some of you may wonder why adherence to universal human rights would not be sufficient, and I really am a big proponent of keeping the universal human rights at the top of our agenda. But in practice, we see that the interpretations are quite diffuse and different in different countries. And so the question of the rule of law as a method rather than as substance of laws would push companies to reveal the rules based upon which, for example, they remove content or select or filter it or promote or demote it. And it would also give transparency on the desired, stated, intended outcomes of artificial intelligence. So I think it could be a foundation for various specific efforts on digital trade, development policies, norms of state behavior, but also antitrust procedures. And it's important for Europe, I think, at this moment in time, also with so much criticism on the role of the private sector, to think not so much of a digital single market, which was always the agenda, but really to think more about a digital single sphere or a shared digital space online where the public interest comes first. And articulating a more global model of how rules can be applied is a clear opportunity for Europe as well. I mentioned it, there is a real vacuum in global leadership, and Europe could step into that space and set a frame with democratic partners, different countries, well-willing companies. I'm thinking of countries like Japan, but also India, extremely important for the future of democracy. Civil society organizations, really horizontal coalitions behind these shared values and methods. So, I will come to a conclusion so that we can soon start the panel discussion, which is usually more interesting. But if there is one thing that I would like you to remember after tonight, it is how much rules and governance actually matter, including for the way in which technology will turn out to impact our lives, the lives of our children, and the lives of people on the other side of the world. When we look at technology, matters of security, economy, and human rights are intertwined, and we're therefore talking about systemic issues and challenges. Now, I tried to sketch how both private companies but also authoritarian states got ahead in governing technology according to their goals and their values, mostly because they took a space that we left wide open. Like in Romania, thinking back about the presidential palace, the heaviest building in the world, turned to parliament. Governance changes everything. But architecture, once it's built, still reflects the values baked into it. And this is more true for the way in which a technology is governed, or at least as much so. Governance for human rights versus repression, fair competition versus a winner-takes-all, inclusion or exclusion. The values get solidified from the moment of design, and often invisibly so. So that makes governance and transparency, accountability, even more important. Without rule of law principles, decisions by profit-driven companies and control-driven states will determine the nature and architecture of our digital world. And when I hear the incredible promises of artificial intelligence, they have a clear echo for what I heard about the promise of an open internet and its democratizing power. We now know that democracy did not go viral as a self-fulfilling prophecy. In fact, the contrary might have happened, and that because of a lack of focus on democratic governments and governance, a lot of time was lost. But because we also see that the utopian promises did not automatically happen, I believe we should not accept a deterministic vision for AI. The way in which we choose to govern technology and the extent to which a rules-based order will extend to the digital world will be vital for the impact on people's lives. So that means the future is in our hands, and I hope we do not make it unheimlich or uncanny. Thank you.
Take a seat. Well, thank you so much, Marietje, for your illuminating wake-up call, really. Caught between top-down state sovereignty and uncanny private monopolies, it seems. We now have the chance to reflect and elaborate further on your thoughts with our top-flight panel guests tonight. And it's my great pleasure to first welcome Lucy Bernholz. Yes. Lucy is a senior research scholar at the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, and she directs the Digital Civil Society Lab there. And she has been looking specifically at the nexus of philanthropy, so mostly foundations, civil society, and the digital transformation. She runs a blog entitled Philanthropy 2173, and yes, you mean the year 2173 in it, because you really want your readers to look at the very long term. We are delighted that you could come over from California and could be with us tonight. Welcome. Thank you very much. My next guest is Joanna Goodey. There's Joanna. She will come in a second. She's in a very analog place. Let me now welcome Krzysztof Izdebski, who joins us from Poland today. Krzysztof, you direct ePaństwo Foundation, and you look at the relationship between governments and civil society, or citizens really, in Poland and other Central and Eastern European countries. You're a lawyer specialized in access to public information, also electoral campaign finances and anti-corruption work. And in these weeks, Krzysztof's team prepares for the 8th PDF. It's the Personal Democracy Forum in Gdańsk in Poland. And what we find interesting about this, next year, the PDF will commemorate the 40th anniversary of the founding of Solidarity, the Polish labor union that was started at the Gdańsk shipyard in 1980. And more than 500 participants in next year's Personal Democracy Forum will focus on one exercise for 2 or 3 days. They will take the 21 demands that Solidarity published in 1980 upon its inception and rewrite those 21 demands from the perspective of the digital age. Welcome, Krzysztof. My next guest is Joanna Goodey, originally from the UK, who works here in Vienna. She's head of research at the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. And this is an EU body that looks at the fundamental rights situation in the EU through research and data collection and brings the results back to the EU institutions and member states. Joanna currently chairs the EU Agency's Network on Scientific Advice and is a member of the European Commission's high-level expert group on artificial intelligence. You have published widely, including a book on victims of crime. So thank you so much for joining us, Joanna. Now, I welcome a guest that many of you here in Vienna know quite well, because I guess together with Max Schrems and Ingrid Brodnik, he's often seen as the internet policy pioneer and policy influencer from Austria, Thomas Lohninger. You're the executive director of the digital rights NGO epicenter.works in Vienna and a senior fellow of the Mozilla Foundation working on net neutrality in the European Union. Thomas is also on the board of the European digital rights organization EDRI. This is an association of 42 digital human rights organizations from across Europe and beyond. Thank you so much, Thomas. Let me go into this and pick up with Thomas right away. Because while many of us here know you as a digital rights expert, not so many people know that you actually studied social and cultural anthropology. So I wonder what made you go from studying anthropology into becoming one of the digital rights pioneers from this country and in the EU.
Thank you for that question. I mean, what my story can tell you is really just an echo of Marietje's speech. So I studied anthropology actually after I was already in IT. I started programming when I was 13. And I was a nerd before that. I like Star Trek and stuff. But it was really that experience with first toying with the computer with 13. Because it taught me that you can do whatever your curiosity shows you with the computer, and you cannot break it. You can always reinstall the operating system. And the important lessons that I took away from that is that technology is a quite neutral thing. What we do with it actually depends very much on us as humans. You could use a computer like you can use a knife to cut bread or to kill somebody. Facebook can start a democratic uprising in Arab countries, or it can help elect Donald Trump. It is always, at the end, the values that we prescribe within technology that define the usage that it has for society. And why this is the field in which I'm also professionally and politically active is because I have the strong belief that it is our generation that builds that house in Romania. It is our generation that creates the foundational structure of information society. Within a few decades, these systems will be built, and it will be quite hard to come up with a new mobile operating system, with a new platform for commerce or social interactions. And therefore, it is such an interesting time, because right now we are, particularly in Europe, at this point where we can really craft the future. And we are not alone in that craftsmanship. We see a quite libertarian vision of the future in the US and a quite authoritarian one in China. And it's not just the question for Europe whether we can keep something like our Charter of Fundamental Rights in existence as something alive when we turn on a computer or go into a shop and be tracked offline. It is really also a question of sovereignty. Sadly, our politicians often have quite despondency feeling when it comes to technology. They feel like they are powerless when it comes to Google or Facebook. In reality, particularly Europe, should be so confident and so proud of its sovereignty in regulating our information age. We have seen that the past 2 legislative terms in Europe have woken up to these issues, but we are far away from the type of really future-looking generation. And to echo a little bit the last tipping point speech of Timothy Snyder, when he was talking about digital human rights as something that is only possible in Europe. He was in his brilliant speech, he was always repeating this one phrase, isn't it interesting that you have enemies? And I want to pick up on that, because isn't it interesting that we are now in a situation in Europe where we would have all of this regulatory power, where it's not the US or China with their products and their companies, but it is Europe with the General Data Protection Regulation, the most modern privacy law that is now setting a standard. Isn't it interesting that we have all this regulatory power, but we are unaware of it? That we are not debating it? That so few people are aware of this interesting time that we are in right now. And I believe we need 2 things to be successful here. First is the magnanimity to look at our past mistakes in our history. We need the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the rule of law as a beacon to guide us in these things. And secondly, we need the courage to really rethink most of the structures, because so much will change in our schools, in our parliaments, and in our economy. And I think we need to be brave to really craft that future.
Wow. So you mentioned the Charter of Fundamental Rights, but you also mentioned the regulatory superpower of the EU. Now, Joanna, you also this afternoon showed a sign of relief that after a snap poll we took in this circle of experts and activists, we saw a clear majority voting for regulation in favor of ethics to guide us on artificial intelligence. how do you see this from the perspective of the Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU? And what are really the challenges and the opportunities, but also are the fundamental rights enough, or do we need even more, as Marietje has indicated on the power of law and rule of law?
Well, what I said today is that I was pleasantly surprised that so many people in the room were referring to the need for regulation, because the discussion about the use of AI and new technology has, in recent months, the past couple of years, been dominated by a discussion on ethics. And of course, ethics and law are so closely intertwined that they are different, of course. Now, a lot of the discussion about ethics, one can be a little bit cautious about, or even cynical, because as I said earlier today, we, just in our brief look at the EU member states, we were counting in excess of 100, getting on for 130 plus various ethics guidelines that are being issued by different entities. And it was only on Tuesday, I think, that Facebook announced that they're going to have a board to look at certain things. So it's the kind of panic scenario, or rather showing that we're doing the right thing by looking at ethics, and we want to resist, if one wants to be cynical about this, any form of hard law and regulation. So let's go for the soft option, because ethics is not the same as law. You don't go before a court, an ethics court. You go before a court of law. Of course, ethics is another layer in that tier of oversight. So I think we can see a shift towards looking at a regulatory framework, and we have the new president-elect of the Commission having announced that is what they're going to be looking at. But of course, the reality is you can have the best law drafted in the world after 2 years or however long it's going to take. GDPR took months and months and years. But the reality is in the implementation of the law, because we've got a lot of regulation in the EU. A lot of it predates AI, which currently has to be applied and has to adapt to the AI situation. Now, there's a resistance to have over-regulation, too much regulation, but there is an acknowledgement that we need to do something, that ethics, while very good, foundation of a lot of law, cannot be the only answer. And I think we very much have to look at our oversight bodies in the EU. And one can draw comparisons to different areas. So we have regulation and we have bodies, of course, for data protection. We know about that now. But we can also look at other areas: chemicals, medicines, food standards. And we would never think in those areas that we would not have proper oversight, and we would not have an authority to look into this issue of chemicals can do harm and can also do good for the public. The same applies for AI. So it's whether we have the shifting ground to say, let's adopt regulation, whether we have the harmonization of that within the EU, that there's support for that across the member states, we will have to see. And then if law does come into place, we will have to see if we have really the true level of enforcement. Do we have an architecture that's strong enough in the EU? One can argue that the data protection authorities have been grossly under-resourced to deal with the general data protection regulation. So you can have as much law as you like, but you have to be able to enforce it, and you have to have these really strong oversight bodies. So underpinning all of that, of course I'm going to say that coming from the Fundamental Rights Agency, that you have to have that red thread going through everything is that it's not only about privacy, it's not only about data protection, it's not only about equality and non-discrimination through misuse or inadequate data, it's about all areas of our lives which fundamental rights crosses in its entirety. And it's a huge job.
So while regulation and that side is one side of the story, of course, governmental practice is the other side of the story. And Krzysztof, you recently looked in a survey in several Central European countries at how exactly and if governments use algorithms, or you say automated decision mechanisms, in their daily relationship and dealing with citizens. And what you found was not only very positive
Optimistic.
or encouraging.
Or encouraging.
Tell us a bit more about how this relationship between government and citizens has also been changing over time now in light of the digital challenge.
Sure. I think like this is like the whole discussion, debate on technology is now focused on AI also, because this is something that we're afraid of, and it is justified fear. But also, from my point of view, that sometimes we're talking about it and forget about the things that are already in the place. So like algorithms and automated decision making that is supporting governments in recruitment to kindergarten, in distribution of social benefits, in allocating judges, or fraud detection. I mean, these are the good things and bad things at the same time, of course. But the problem that we having now when we're discussing the regulation of AI, we don't have any regulation of the system which are in place. So the question that we asked ourselves, also from the CE perspective, is we agree that technology has an impact on society, but like does society has an impact on technology actually? And how much of this is also the part, on one hand, the responsibility of the public officials, and on the other one, how does it change their work? They are also impacted by using automated decision making in very different way. We are already partially governed by algorithms, and this is something that we would never escape from when not thinking about how to regulate the thing. Why the regulation is important? The regulation is important because there is lack of knowledge, not even in front of the civil society or the society as such, but public officials had no idea how some algorithm works. They have much more secrecy inside the office as such than they had it before, when the people were responsible for the decisions by themselves. And yes, we agree that the people are biased, and the argument why we use automated decision making, because we can make, like with allocation of judges, we can basically have a more fair system of allocating the person to the specific court case. But the important thing is that algorithms can be biased as well. Do we want to team up people with biases and algorithm with biases? This is a very risky mixture, isn't it?
So where is the trust going, really?
No, the problem with the trust is, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, and that's our problem with the regulation thing. Do we trust governments that they will regulate it properly? But on the other hand, can we trust machines that are produced by the government? So this is the thing that, especially from the perspective of Central and Eastern Europe, as being also the part of the member states of the European Union, this is the only model that we can take, because we still have much more trust in European Union, that is a Polish perspective, than in our own governments at some point.
Lucy Bernholz, from your lookout post in the year 2173, looking back, what will have prevailed? The power of law or the law of power?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me. And if it is going to be the power of law, it's going to depend on this moment and this Europe. Because the vacuum of leadership that's invested in controlling technologies, whether we're talking about something as seemingly basic nowadays as pervasive data collection, all the way to the potential of general artificial intelligence, there is no leadership coming from the United States of America. There's no leadership coming from the United States of America, I'll repeat it. There is leadership coming from tech companies based in the United States of America, but that's a very different thing. There is very strong leadership coming from China, as has been mentioned, but not in line with the values that the European Union is based on. There are some allies for the European Union, Canada, California, but not the United States of America. But the political will, the nature of the structure in the U.S. is difficult. And I think on these issues, on this desire for the rule of law to be implemented in this space, it is the opportunity for the European Union to lead. I think what has been remarkable in how powerful it's been is the degree to which over almost 35 years now, digital capacities have infiltrated our lives to the point in which everyone in this room, I will posit, is dependent on them, literally dependent on these technologies. Yet we continue to believe that we can't understand them, and because we can't see them, we shouldn't regulate them. The first of those is completely false, and the second of those is a marketing tool that's been remarkably successful and exported right along with the software code. But neither of them is true. And the European Union and Europeans have never sort of fallen for this in the past. And so the opportunity to step forward and say, what we have here is a fundamental shift in the nature of our economic structures and our social structures. It's akin to a shift from moving from a land-based system to a water-based system. But just as the European Union has built laws for the land of the European Union, there are laws that extend to the sea. And it's just as critical that we take the values that we've identified and that you've codified and apply them in these other spaces. There's really nothing that unique about this as an industry with a set of vested interests to distinguish it from other industries. And the rights of people the rights of democratic systems to govern and require that the tools that are used in that system be governed in accordance with those expectations applies in this space as much as it does anywhere else.
Well, coming back to Marietje, when you listen to Lucy, but also what Thomas said, somebody suggested this afternoon, what if people could have known the truth but didn't care enough to act? So let's focus for a moment on the perspective and the awareness and even maybe knowledge of European citizens. Are they aware of the important role that the EU plays in this moment of time in the world regarding digital rights? But also, what do we do when we are even sitting here in a country where not many months ago a minister suggested that the power should sit above the law? So how do we get out of this sort of democracy trap that we might have gotten ourselves already in, no matter where we look right now?
So let me start with the first question. Do people know how wonderful the European Union is? Not enough. Not enough. I've spent 10 years to try to engage people, and normally the most easily accessible topics were the most hands-on. And believe it or not, but the elimination of roaming charges and the easier use of these technologies was fundamental for people to make tangible what we can do to make their lives better. But of course, and this is where Thomas and I have shared blood, sweat, and tears from different sides of the same question, much more fundamental in the telecoms package were rules for the digital economy that we call net neutrality, which imply fair competition, equality of treatment between smaller and larger companies, non-discrimination of data, so that you as a user decide where you want to surf online and not commercial agreements. Very, very important, very, very fundamental. And I think a smaller portion of the population understands why that was important. Small and medium-sized enterprises certainly understood it, as well as the sort of tech community to the extent that that, is like a group. But another element where I think people are becoming very much aware and where we also see a tipping point, which we haven't touched upon yet, but I think is very important, is the whole question of taxation. Antitrust, they've seen what Marietje Schaake has done, which is very important, and the fact that she does the same for a gas company from Russia or a tech company from the United States when the rules are violated also shows that this is a rules-based system, that it doesn't discriminate, but it's principle-based, and I think that that builds trust in a time where trust in politics is quite low. Trust in institutions like that is still high. And now the question of taxation is interesting because clearly we have to find a way to meet the inequality problems, and I'm always amused when I hear tech CEOs, when they're asked about job displacement and robotics and automation, talk about the answer being universal basic income, right? It's a quite fashionable answer for CEOs to give. I would invite them maybe a bit of a traineeship on national budgets, but it's interesting that those same companies whose CEOs are talking about universal basic income are lobbying against taxation because guess what? Like that's what redistribution is all about. So we have to, I think, keep breaking down the principles to examples that hit home for people in order to reach larger parts of the population, which I think is always important in a democracy, to bring people close to the decision making. It's something that we really focus on a lot in Europe by interpreting in different languages, by making sure the press has access, that a lot of meetings are live streamed, that civil society is paid, subsidized also with public funds to participate and voice the public interest, etc., etc. So yes, it's very important. Are we there yet? No. We're also not there at the ambition level that I think we need to be. I think we're articulating an encouragement at this podium to the new group of new European political leaders. I don't think anyone thinks the status quo is enough.
What about the democracy trap?
Yes, sorry, I almost forgot about that. I believe that these are all parts of the same problem, erosion of democracy. And I wish we had a better grip on what is the chicken and what is the egg. Is there more polarization because people are continuously presented with very upsetting posts on social media? Or is it also a phenomenon that would be equally strong without it? Would the leaders that we now hear, often newcomers, making promises, that what they could achieve is much better than the people who've actually taken responsibility, would these people, without social media, have full rooms like this? Or is there something in the digital ecosystem that maybe allows money to have bigger exposure and therefore gives certain people an advantage, maybe is used in ways with new tactics that we're learning more about, pushing political messages or other kinds of influencing messages. For me, the fact that we don't know for sure is a big problem. Because what we do know, and what I tried to share also in my introduction with a couple of examples, that the idea that information is political and that the way in which we allow information to flow has huge impact, that's a centuries-old phenomenon. And yet, we have these massive amounts of information and data and metadata and patterns that we can distill from that, and ads we can place against it, and we don't know exactly how it works. And for me, I wish we would all focus more on how precious democracy is and how much we need to fill that, what you call democracy gap, and that we would do everything it takes to get the knowledge also out of these programs and business models to understand what is going on in our democracy.
Maybe just briefly to Joanna here, the Fundamental Rights Agency engages a lot in awareness raising across the board of fundamental rights and why they are important. Have you seen an increased awareness and knowledge also in the young generation in these last years?
that's something that I can only answer in the point at which we have that data available. So, for example, what we do is we gather evidence on the situation of fundamental rights in the EU, be it our work in relation to AI, our current work on facial recognition, the work we've done on mass surveillance by intelligence services and the oversight of that, the work we've done on data interoperability. Most of what we do feeds the EU institutions and the member states. Again, because our capacity to do everything is delimited. So we focus our resources really on feeding that evidence-based advice, that factual, objective evidence. And in an age when people often say, we don't need facts, we need emotion, we still believe we have to have good, robust, objective, independent research findings that you feed to the right people who can make a difference as the Fundamental Rights Agency. And if you ask about the public and their attitudes or their awareness, that was your question, I mean, there's other instruments in the context of the EU, the Eurobarometer, the famous Eurobarometer surveys, which dip into public opinion every now and then. And we can see increased awareness about privacy and data protection amongst the public. So I think one thing that has happened with the general data protection regulation is that every time you turn your phone on, your consent. It's very annoying, but it's raised that consciousness amongst people who are not privacy lawyers, data protection people. It has done that job, and it's got people thinking about these issues. So it's done a tremendous job of raising awareness, not only about the few of us who are interested in human rights, fundamental rights, and the specifics of privacy and data protection. So we can see that even through what seemed quite a dry bit of legislation when it was in the making, for many people it seemed dry, but we knew it would be phenomenal in terms of its impact, it has increased public awareness. But in the bigger question of, are the public on board for lots of these things that are happening, we have yet to see. Time will tell. I see it's the evidence of, we see, are the public increasingly aware of the impact on their everyday lives, but it really needs, if you're talking awareness campaigns, you need to put any bit of research or any bit of legislation times X. Keep adding the zeros for a campaign before people become aware. And most campaigns run for a year, they stop, everybody forgets, and you start again. So I think the point about the EU, everybody knows when you go to an airport, you might see that poster, was your flight delayed and what are your rights? But there's a lot more, of course, the EU can do and is trying to do in other areas, but of course that demands a lot of money to raise awareness for the general public. But just very briefly, I think it's so important that we raise awareness amongst those who can make policy changes.
Exactly.
And that's where we focus as a Fundamental Rights Agency, make those aware who can change the law and make policy changes, because they're the people who can make it happen first.
Just very briefly, because one thing that concerns me a lot is that even if there's more awareness of the threats to fundamental rights, let's say, or the challenges of data gathering and privacy, I think it's very important to then, on top of that, empower people that they can do something, so that they don't get discouraged by awareness. Because one of the elements that I believe we're dealing with also relates to the whole democracy question is there's a tendency to think about disinformation, about fake news, can we convince people of crazy things, like the earth is flat or something? And then a lot of people will say, of course not, so it's irrelevant. But the real agenda, I believe, is to discourage people from participating, to trusting anyone at all, trusting democratic institutions. And therefore, if there's like fear awareness, so to say, which is also being spread, then it can also turn into people withdrawing. And what we need to do is to have people engaging and show that they have agency to decide. Everybody's a decision maker. Every single person can be part of determining where we're all going together in this democracy.
Thomas?
Yeah, just briefly, I first wanted to touch on this point about saving democracy, which I think is crucial, and where also digital rights and technology come into play, because how can you have a democracy if everybody has their own filter bubble and we don't have common debates anymore? If you have personalized election promises, if you have newsfeed algorithms that polarize us and divide us instead of having that debate. But the more interesting thing that I would like to note is that the German word for Netzpolitik, is also, it has a double meaning. It is the classical digital rights debate that we are having right now, and then it also has the meaning of those questions where the internet is changing politics itself. Because I also see an obligation in our community to update our democracy, to update the tools of participation, may it be engaging with your elected representatives or also opening up government structures. How easy it can be to send a FOIA request that asks the EU, or how to, I don't know, send faxes to the European Parliament like we did it with net neutrality, or DDoSing the Parliament for like 40,000 calls for
Don't do that again.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
It worked. Anyways, I also see that there is great potential in digitalization of our parliaments to make them more transparent, to make our legislative process machine readable. And at the end, this is all about legitimacy, about giving people a sense that it's their government and their country, and their taxes.
Well, coming back to Lucy, you study and you work a lot with civil society, and you have often been observing that particularly NGO and civil society leaders are technophobes. How do we sign up this important group to the awareness but also the mobilization that Marietje and Thomas talk about?
Certainly not all civil society leaders are technophobes. I think they're generally under-resourced, so they're not technologically advanced. And to the degree that anyone has drunk the Kool-Aid that technology will sort of default to greater democracy and more participation, I think under-resourced organizations looking for low financial cost solutions are quick to gravitate toward technologies that have a very small dollar sign attached to them, and they are less familiar with the other kinds of costs associated with them. But I think it's actually quite critical that civil society organizations recognize that, and all of us as actors and agents in civil society and in our countries, that the entire civil society policy agenda that sits before us going forward is essentially a digital policy agenda. Because it is in digital spaces, it is with digital tools, and by that I mean nothing more complicated than the cell phone in your pocket, that we now mobilize, organize, assemble, and express ourselves. Those basic core rights to express ourselves and to come together. Without those two, there is no civil society. And those two things now happen almost entirely either consciously in digital spaces, unconsciously in digital spaces, or as we're seeing in places like Hong Kong and Venezuela, consciously around digital spaces because of the nature of the digital spaces. In other words, the lab that we so aspirationally called the Digital Civil Society Lab when we launched 6 years ago, with the goal of being able to remove the digital once everybody sort of caught up to what we were talking about, it has come true. All of civil society is digital, and civil society's policy agenda, whether you're working on food security or immigration, helping the elderly or helping the very young, it's a digital policy agenda. Without it, we don't exist.
Well, this is where you also told us that, Krzysztof, you bring grassroots groups, whether they work in ecological, social questions, together in a room with IT programmers and coders on a more systematic basis. What is your experience, and how can we scale that?
That's an adventure, because we're bringing the people from completely different sectors, like people speaking different languages in a way. But before that, I want to amplify the thing that Joanna said with educating the decision makers. I mean, this is one of the failure, I think, in a sense, of the whole movement, or an open data movement, that we were like working so much with people, empowering people, giving them this potential of opening data and then using the data, making or giving them a dream of making the evidence-based policy is possible. And then they come in to see with decision maker, to talk with them. And the response, usually after 30 minutes of presenting the data and showing the complicated analytics, which is made thanks to technology, the MP is standing up and saying like, oh yeah, but my uncle's sister has said that it's something else. And then we're confronting the people that were really, thinking that this will change something. So definitely, I think this is an aim also for the community that you're referring to work more with policymakers, with decision makers, with the MPs or other people who are at the government, also to understand that the data help in their work. When it comes to bringing these two communities together, it's a fascinating story. We're doing it through different projects, but I think the most important one is the Code for Poland, or its broader Code for All, which we, having the people, the local activists, the representatives of civil society, that knows that technology might help, might empower them, but they have no idea how to do it. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, we have IT people that works in a fascinating environment, but a bit boring when it comes to also exercising your need to change the world. So there is a meeting, and the activists, they try to explain what they really mean, what they really need, and the IT people, they trying to adapt. But this is, as I was saying, this is like two different languages. So our role also is to be a facilitator of the whole project. But what we're having the pure civic tech thing coming out from it. Civic tech, which is a technology that empowers people, the technology for common good. And this is the part of the synergy in a data-driven society that we're talking about. Because you have the civic aspect, so we understand the people. And the people needs the emerging problems of democracy, and you have IT specialists. They want to devote themselves. It's like one of the, like a founder of our foundation who just did it after hours working as an entertainment industry IT specialist. And then he was just fed up with a really bad quality of the parliamentary website in Poland. And he did it in like, a couple of weeks, much better. He's shamed. And then the parliament actually changed the website on based on the thing that Daniel, the CEO of ePaństwo, did. So this is a part of introduction of the change through working with civil society and IT specialists who are ready to do it or willing to do it.
So you're sitting here because of that?
Yeah, I'm sitting representing the civic part, but I see the synergy is super important in regulation, in all topics we're talking now. I mean, this is the technology is not something which is out there. Wow. Technology is everywhere. Technology is connected with regulations, with air quality, with corruption, transparency, all the stuff that we're doing now. We are all deep in technology.
Before we open up for the audience, I would like this panel to give us one sentence each. What should the von der Leyen Commission do in this next cycle until 2024? And what is your long-term vision for the European leadership to come through in the long term? Starting with Lucy.
It's always nice to be invited to someone else's country to tell you what to do. And being an arrogant American, I will. Be bold. Be bold and grab it. I agree a great deal with Thomas's comment that what we set in place now will be as significant as that Romanian building will be for decades to come. We don't have a great deal of time because while the forces that are committed to a democratic process and instilling the principles of the rule of law as they apply to digital technologies are deliberative. Your opponents are not so deliberative. They're not so participatory. They do move quickly, and they're moving quite quickly. So the opportunity is now to really set a stage, to put in place some pillars and some regulations and some guardrails for the future. The technology will continue to change, but those guardrails have held steady for decades, and they need to be carried into the digital sea, just as they worked well here for decades in the analog land.
Yeah, I mean, I love the whole idea when a European Union or European Commission is working with panel of experts, etc. But I think if we agree that everyone now has some interest in discussing technology because it has such strong impact on us individually and society, I think what the European Commission should do, or European Council, in this regard, is to also open for a much greater participation of people, citizens, in this process of regulation. Because so far I'm not really seeing it. It's really hard in a sense that to understand how the process, legislative process works, how the situation is complicated when it comes to the lobbying that got a lot of money for putting their own agenda. And I think this ideas how to engage the people in this discussion, this is the crucial also in the terms of having a trust or gaining a trust towards EU institutions.
So this was short-term and long-term?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm thinking, in this
Joanna?
way.
So what I would say is that we have to make sure that in the development of legislation and policy attached to legislation, that you have to have a thorough fundamental rights impact assessment from the very, very outset. And that doesn't mean a reference in the preamble of draft legislation to the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, of which there is very low awareness, though that is increasing, she says optimistically. You need these thorough, what we call ex-ante fundamental rights evaluations, and that goes beyond, like I said earlier, looking at privacy, data protection. It goes to those areas plus all other areas, the rights of the elderly, the rights of the child, the impact on the environment, freedom of expression. The list is endless, but you need a thorough fundamental rights digging down into the implications of the use of technology, and also a review of existing law. Is it fit for purpose in relation to this technology? And then in the future, what you do need, if you have looked at law and you have done your thorough fundamental rights assessment, going back to the point I made earlier, is that you have to implement the law. You have to make sure that people are aware of their law, they have the right to redress, they have access to justice, because again, best laws in the world, but if people can't access justice, it shouldn't cost too much, it should be accessible, that people know where to go, and the bodies should be able to enforce the law and have sufficient experts to understand what we're talking about when it relates to AI. So it's about enforcing what the EU is very good at, is our very long-established institutions. And we have many institutions that, really we have a lot of respect around the world for, and they need to be reinforced and have the power to do their job, because the founding triumvirate of the EU is democracy, human rights, and rule of law. And for that, you need strong institutions that cannot be eroded.
Mm-hmm. Crisp and brief.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. But my thought experiment would be for von der Leyen, that she should imagine the look back from historians at her term, if she gets it right. If she really starts being bold with her digital policy based on fundamental rights and the rule of law, what historic impact that could have, and what importance also worldwide for the standards that Europe could set. Mm-hmm. And I think if she could see that image, maybe we have a good chance.
Marietje?
Well, I think she has to see the strategic interest for Europe to act. We here all care a lot about fundamental rights, but we are a little bit of an exception. Exactly. This needs to be understood as an economic interest, a security interest, a quality of life interest, a truly comprehensive agenda. And I think the good news here is that in the 10 years that I served in European Parliament, there was not a single area like technology where so many people reached out to us. You know, emails, petitions, panel discussions, tweets, all kinds of engagements, because actually the tech topics, whether it's about copyright or cybersecurity or package deliveries from what you order online or roaming costs, people feel how close it is to their personal lives. So if von der Leyen can understand the global strategic interest and then bring the Europeans on board, she has the golden formula.
Just to give you the snap vote on what our expert and activists group said today, priority until 2024, most votes went to a theme called accountability of big tech until 2024, next European elections. And in the long run, the priority that our group made up was to create the legal and technological infrastructure, for example, a data bank or a public data trust that will move data ultimately from private companies to a public domain, so to say. I know it's late, and I know we have been here for a long time, but this is also a fascinating and unique opportunity to have this conversation here with such great guests. I want to invite you to 3 questions from the audience. I ask you to introduce yourself, stand up, and ask your question in a really crisp and short manner, so that our panel can answer these before we close this evening. I see one hand over there on the left.
Thank you so much. My name is Ludmila Bogdan, and I'm a sociologist at Harvard. And just happened that I do study awareness and information campaigns. And today we heard a lot about getting public involved, raising awareness. And I would like to just have a brief comment that usually increase in information doesn't lead to a change in behavior, and it's a huge problem. I looked at different problems as migration issues and human trafficking, and it's something that policymaking organizations have to look at, not only the information they distribute, but also seeing how public is affected by that, because it's a very different thing just giving information, but also expecting a change in behavior. Thank you.
Lucy or Krzysztof, one of you?
You want to go ahead?
Well, there wasn't really a question, but
Yeah.
it's absolutely right. Data doesn't change behavior. A great deal of other things are necessary to change behavior. I think in terms of the kinds of issues, getting an actual EU citizen or a resident of an EU country to care about the kinds of conversations that are happening at the parliamentary level requires a very different awareness approach than something that has anything to do actually with sort of the broadcasting of information. It has to do with actually the experience that every person in this room and every person in the 28 member states has with that device in their pocket. When they walk out their door and are surrounded by CCTVs, when they think about what happens with the data that they may be collecting from their Fitbit or their other device, or when they realize that they cannot in fact access the basic information from their city or national or the EU government because the information is perhaps only digitized and they don't have access to that platform, or it's not digitized and they only have access to that platform. It has to happen at a visceral level. Then you can change individual behavior. And the advantage that you have on this particular issue is that you've got a population that is, and I'll repeat it again, dependent on the device in their pocket. Dependent on it. So how it works matters to them. How we help them engage in how that is regulated is a different question, but they are dependent on those devices.
Yeah, and also what is important in this regard is having this feeling that actually you are being heard. I mean, that's the thing that you try to say to politicians. It's also confronted with their responsiveness. I mean, this is also something that makes them disillusions about being engaged participant of the public discussion. And you have these fears sometimes that you know, it's not worth to take your time and be engaged because your voice would be never heard. And this is also the huge role for politicians, for EU institutions, like to make it just the process simpler. I see it's going on, I mean, it's happening, but also give more opportunity. But just, we're living in a very fast times. We need also have a very fast access to understand the regulations and how the process looks. And this is we can support just by making also people a choice.
The lady over there.
My name is Dagmar Coleman. I am a non-executive director in a number of European companies, and I work in a commission that advises the German government on issues of antitrust. I'm incredibly inspired listening to your speech, Marietje, and by the discussion, by the panel discussion I hope you heard so far. Yeah. And I feel a lot of can-do attitude and positivism, and I hear of initiatives that make an awful lot of sense and really should make all of us feel optimistic. On the other side, we have I would say, one of the most critical times in history, in my lifetime, happening right in front of us, and I'm very worried about the changes in the perception about the ability of democracy to solve problems in Europe and globally. I don't know how what you're talking about, Marietje, can reach the public in a much more powerful way. I feel politicians, political parties, institutions are in crisis mode, self-absorbed, and are not touching on the issues of the future. There is no vision, not only on this topic, but also looking at the big problems across Europe, employment outlook, changes in industry that are going to affect all of us, etc. The European Union is not reaching the population in Europe. Even the election campaigns, what you're talking about, I know about from my work, but we're not hitting the people. And with all of the laudable initiatives, what can we do to magnify the reach? Because I think the EU itself is under crisis, under attack. What's happening in Brexit has taken away so much trust. And there is a risk that much more will happen. So we have huge issues to solve. This is one of them. How, with all of your experience, do you think we can make a change happen, but also the EU can reach the population more effectively?
So, a couple of things, and this is truly maybe the only one thing that's become easier for me to say now that I'm not in politics anymore, which is democracy costs money. All these things that you mentioned, and I agree, I mean, the more participation, the better. A Dutch member of European Parliament, a Dutch member of Parliament has one assistant. One. The amount of emails, the amount of invitations to go to schools, to go to social projects in neighborhoods, to go to innovation hubs, to go to debating clubs, to go to elderly people's homes, to go and speak with students. The amount of invitations are overwhelming. I think on average I said no 5 times for every time I said yes to an invitation. So we have to also create a movement, and maybe this is where people from the business community can help really to address this issue, because people in the so-called institutions who are, in my experience, highly qualified, highly motivated, highly dedicated, are unable to voice this because it will sound as propaganda, it will be labeled as propaganda in the ages that we live in. It's a very delicate balancing act that anyone working for the EU institutions has to walk. I was involved with getting more interactive communications from the so-called institutions. So I started a pilot project years and years and years ago to coordinate the presence of the EU institutions on social media. So the Council, the Commission and the Parliament. And people initially were kind of scared, then embraced it. Was very successful because if the EU talks in 1,000 different directions, anyone running a company doesn't really work very well. Plus institutions don't have a heart, people do. And so it's good to have personal stories about what matters. Anyway, any communication from the EU, if you want to call it that, but the same goes for Parliament, etc., will very easily be attacked as propaganda. That's the ages we live in. So we need people like you who care. and who feel inspired and who think there's something at stake, because democracy belongs to all of us. It doesn't belong in institutions, it doesn't belong in political parties, it belongs in our hearts and on our kitchen table discussions, in our schools, and we have to stand for it. And we cannot allow, this is my biggest concern, that the people who are beating up against it every day, make the most noise, are determining what this story is about, and that we are kind of like rabbits in the headlight. That has to stop. Everybody should feel empowered to act in whatever way he or she is possible.
Maybe a school strike for tech governance that the young have to pull off.
Sorry?
Maybe the young have to pull off a school strike for tech governance.
Yes, sure. Yeah, why not? I mean, I hope the environment will be saved by the school strikes, but at least there's awareness. Yeah.
There were 200,000 people on the street against upload filters just this year. So
Yes.
with questions to the future, it would be good if we listen to the younger generation.
Yes.
We have one last question here, Franz Karl.
Franz Früller from the ERSTE Foundation, Vienna. Thank you for a really very enlightening and challenging discussion. I was yesterday in a meeting with civil society organizations that are dealing with exactly these issues, funded by a group of foundations, Civitatis. ERSTE Foundation is part of that. And there, one of the topics was the reluctance of politicians, of also political parties, to go deeper into the regulatory field. And why is that? And one of the participants phrased it very nicely. He said, because policy-based evidence-making is very easy through the IT, and parties are using that. So what can we do, also as civil society organizations, as foundations as well, and Lucy, you have studied that, where can we as civil society funders bring something to bear on this situation, especially with a view to the possibilities that we now have with networking and also the use of IT technology?
There will be a whole talk about this at the foundation tomorrow, so let's keep it crisp and then continue.
I guess I'll repeat what I said earlier, which is that every bit of work that civil society organizations in Europe are trying to do nowadays, again, almost regardless of issue, is dependent on digital technologies. And what they need is they need an understanding of what compromises they're willing to make in pursuit of the dollars they need to keep the doors open, but in pursuit of their mission, how can they align their digital dependencies with achieving that mission? And I'm being a little bit obtuse here because there's another force at work here, which is the digital corporate capture of civil society. Mm-hmm. And we have to face that as a reality. But to see civil society, to get to the question over here too, in terms of how do you get this information and this engagement to the people? Civil society is one of the first places people begin to engage politically. It's where we begin to take action. And we need to protect that space and empower it, both with the kinds of regulations we're talking about, technologies, but there are also alternative technologies that need to be built, and there are alternative organizational structures that are emerging to make sure that we as individuals continue to have the right to come together and express ourselves as a collective in order to make the world the way we want to see it. That's the fundamental process of civil society. Digital is part of that, and there are a number of different ways, from the technological to the legal to the social to the organizational, that all have to be thought about together in order to really enable people to continue to be able to act that way.
Very briefly, and maybe I was just interpreting your question a certain way, but if you were saying that there's money that needs to go somewhere, I was talking to someone last weekend who works for an American fund called the Democracy Fund, and to my knowledge, Europe doesn't have such a thing. We have open society foundations which have done incredible work, but which are under incredible attack, as you probably all know, which makes it harder for some organizations to work with them. But the mission and ERSTE Stiftung knows this very well, of protecting the values of open societies and protecting democracy is more urgent than ever.
Yes.
So maybe a strategic effort between the foundations to provide that non-corporate money, because I couldn't agree more. It is an incredible trap, and it's very difficult for civil society, people who are working in these organizations to deal with as well. So having a public interest democracy fund that's free of corporate interest and has maybe many resources coming together so that it is not labeled as coming from one source or the other that could be tainted, the way they so easily get these days, I think would be an enormous contribution to today's Europe and as a proxy to democracy in the world.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for making such a rich conversation possible here. Goodbye to all of you on live stream. And for those of you who are here in the Museum of Applied Arts, we welcome you to keep the conversation going, keep the exchange going outside. There is a reception waiting for us, and you're welcome to continue that over a glass of wine. Thank you again for coming here.